17. Chosen ones, you made them admit it. You're a psychological warfare master. The truth doesn't knock politely. It doesn't wait for a formal invitation. It does not apologize for interrupting your afternoon. And it certainly does not wipe its feet at the door before stepping heavily into the room. Sometimes, the truth simply kicks the heavy wooden door completely off its hinges, shatters the fragile glass windows of comfortable illusion, and drags absolutely everyone out into the harsh, uncompromising, freezing light of day. Most people out in the world do not genuinely hate intelligence, and they do not inherently despise success. What they absolutely loathe, what makes their blood boil, and their deep-seated insecurities violently flare, is what your quiet intelligence and your steady success forces them to painfully feel about their own manufactured ignorance and their own comfortable stagnation. They do not hate your brilliant light. They hate that your light effortlessly illuminates the filthy, unhealed corners of the room they have spent their entire adult lives desperately trying to hide from the world. Chosen ones, you are witnessing this exact undeniable dynamic playing out in real time, and I want to deeply validate the incredibly confusing, intensely heavy, and often profoundly isolating situation you are currently navigating. You have been quietly carrying the massive weight of a profound spiritual awakening. You have been walking through the agonizing fires of your own personal growth, enduring your painful seasons of isolation, and suddenly, almost overnight, you find yourself completely surrounded by insecure, toxic, highly performative individuals who are doing absolutely everything in their frantic power to either blatantly mimic your frequency or aggressively tear it down to the dirt. You have watched former friends, family members, or longtime colleagues absolutely melt down over your authentic success, exposing their true, toxic colors in ways that have left you completely stunned and slightly amused. You have watched people you once trusted morph into hidden, bitter competitors, throwing subliminal shots, trying desperately to sabotage your inner peace, and engaging in bizarre, completely unprovoked, one-sided rivalries. They arrogantly thought they were playing a manipulative game that you simply did not understand. They truly believed they had you completely cornered in their petty little psychological traps, heavily banking on your deep empathy to keep you permanently blind to their intentions. But you made them admit it, by simply existing in your truth, by holding your solid ground and entirely refusing to break character. You inadvertently became a master of psychological warfare without ever having to fire a single retaliatory shot. You let them overplay their weak hands, and in doing so, they completely, publicly exposed the intensely performative, hollow nature of their entire existence. The overarching, undeniable theme of this exact moment in your journey is absolute, unfiltered revelation. They melted down, not because of any malicious thing you did to them, but simply because of what your raw, authentic presence represents. A towering, divine standard they secretly know they can never, ever reach. Let's dive deep into this. Let's break down exactly why their masks are slipping so violently, why their desperate attempts to compete with you have turned into a goofy public spectacle, and why you currently hold absolutely all the psychological power in this dynamic. Let's get into it. Before we break down the absolute core of this psychological dynamic, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Number 1. You completely strip them of their favorite weapon by giving them the terrifying gift of your absolute, unbothered silence. In the dark, manipulative realm of psychological warfare, the most devastating move you can ever make is not a loud, aggressive counterattack. It is the absolute refusal to step onto the battlefield altogether. You must understand that highly performative, toxic people operate on a very strict, highly predictable script. They push a specific button, and they expect you to react in a specific way. They throw a subtle, passive-aggressive insult, and they expect you to scramble frantically for their approval. They manufacture a sudden crisis, and they expect you to bleed your precious energy trying to fix it for them. You, however, operate from a deeply anchored internal architecture. You have built your peace through hard-earned, agonizing spiritual trials, contrasting sharply with their flimsy, borrowed, insecure facade that requires constant external validation just to remain upright. When you stopped reacting, you triggered a profound psychological collapse within them. The deep psychology here is rooted in their absolute, primal terror of irrelevance and their crippling fear of losing control. They rely entirely on a script where your emotional outburst feeds their fragile ego. It validates their fake power. When you give them absolute, unbothered silence, you are essentially freezing their psychological bank accounts. You are cutting off the emotional oxygen they absolutely need to survive the day. Without your reaction to constantly distract them, they are violently forced to confront the terrifying stagnation of their own unhealed trauma. Their entire sense of self is built on the delusional premise that they can permanently influence and control the emotional weather of the people around them. By remaining totally silent, you shatter that delusion instantly. Metaphorically, it is exactly like watching someone frantically trying to stack a flimsy house of cards on a violently windy table, desperately trying to build a towering monument of dominance while you are quietly, methodically stacking heavy, solid bricks on unshakable ground. They look over at your fortress, realize their paper tower is collapsing, and instead of finding better materials, they just start screaming at the wind. This is exactly why their behavior looks so incredibly goofy, frantic, and deeply tragic from the outside. They are performing for an audience that you do not even care about. You watch them constantly escalate their behavior, trying to provoke a reaction, throwing elaborate temper tantrums in a completely empty room. They see the unshakable confidence, but they willfully ignore the years of internal shadow work required to maintain it. They see the calm, but they completely miss the resilience. You made them admit, without ever uttering a single syllable, that their perceived power over you was nothing but a fragile illusion all along. Number 2, you relentlessly force people to confront the intelligence and profound potential they deliberately abandoned for the sake of cheap comfort. Chosen ones, you have bravely chosen the exceptionally difficult, unglamorous path of true spiritual and intellectual evolution. You read, you heal, you deeply introspect, and you actively, painfully dismantle your own generational traumas in the dark. The highly performative people who are currently trying to bring you down have chosen the exact polar opposite. They chose the comfortable path of least resistance. They decided a very long time ago that true self-actualization was far too painful, required far too much personal accountability, and demanded far too much honesty. So they comfortably settled for a highly performative facade. They eagerly wear the shiny, rented costume of success, but they absolutely lack the internal spiritual bandwidth to actually sustain it when the lights finally go out. The stark contrast between your unyielding pursuit of authentic alignment and their desperate clinging to comforting lies is completely blinding. You possess the mental agility to hold complex, uncomfortable truths, while their entire worldview violently collapses the absolute moment it is gently questioned. The psychology driving their visceral, hostile reaction to your intelligence is pure cognitive dissonance, entirely driven by an overwhelming wave of deeply repressed grief. When they look directly at you, they do not just see your success. They see the terrifying, undeniable ghost of the magnificent person they could have become if they had possessed even a tiny fraction of your courage. They deeply resent your sharp mind because it highlights the agonizing fact that they completely sold out their own potential simply to comfortably fit into a mediocre crowd, because confronting their own chosen stagnation is far too painful. Their fragile ego goes on a frantic offensive. They desperately attempt to tear down your spiritual architecture because dismantling your truth is infinitely easier than constructing their own. Think of it exactly like someone who has spent their entire life wearing cheap, counterfeit jewelry that they absolutely cannot afford, parading around town, hoping the fake gold paint does not chip off onto their sweaty skin. Suddenly, you calmly walk into the room wearing a solid, heavy, unpolished piece of raw gold that you pulled from the earth with your own bare hands. Your very presence makes their neck instantly turn green. The blinding light hitting your authenticity oxidizes their performative facade for absolutely everyone to see. It is a deeply tragic sight to witness someone frantically trying to insult your intelligence or belittle your depth when their entire argument is based on emotional dysregulation and easily disproven lies. They are heavily sweating, they are incredibly frantic, and they look profoundly goofy, trying to outmaneuver a mind that is constantly refining itself. You force them to realize that their mind is dull, and their spirit is severely out of shape, and for someone whose massive ego is their only real asset, that realization is absolutely terrifying. Number 3, the absolute tragedy of their stolen aesthetic and the frantic, hollow spiritual mimicry they desperately attempt to pull off. Have you ever paused and noticed how the exact people who seem to harbor the most secret, venomous animosity toward you are incredibly often the exact same ones trying to quietly, systematically copy your mannerisms, your specific vocabulary, your creative ideas, or your aesthetic lifestyle? This is a highly bizarre, but incredibly common, almost textbook phenomenon for chosen ones. You operate from an infinite wellspring of divine, organic inspiration. Your strategic moves, your unique style, and your powerful words are a natural, inevitable byproduct of your deep, hard-won internal alignment. Theirs, conversely, is completely, 100% borrowed. They're acting as skinwalkers in a profoundly spiritual sense. They clearly see the heavy respect you effortlessly command and the unshakable peace you radiate, and they foolishly, childishly believe they can magically acquire those exact things by simply copying your external actions. The deep, dark psychology behind this frantic mimicry is a profound, horrifying emptiness inside their own soul. They absolutely do not have a strong, sovereign core identity. They are completely empty vessels that rely entirely on mirroring others just to feel fundamentally real for a few pathetic minutes. When they attempt to mimic you, it is a desperate, frantic attempt to forcefully steal your spiritual currency because their own internal bank account is utterly, hopelessly bankrupt. They genuinely believe that if they dress like you, talk exactly like you, or suddenly adopt your deeply personal hobbies, the world will finally validate and love them the exact way the universe inherently validates you. But it is an agonizingly futile endeavor because they are fundamentally missing the most critical, irreplaceable ingredient, the divine soul. It is exactly like watching a crew construct a beautiful, elaborate, multi-million-dollar movie set of a grand mansion. From the front, facing the cameras, it looks magnificent, imposing, and completely real. But if you simply walk just 2 steps to the side, you immediately realize it is entirely propped up by cheap wooden beams, and there is absolutely nothing inside. There is no plumbing, no electricity, and absolutely no life. Watching them proudly parade around in a stolen, poorly fitting version of your unique identity looks deeply goofy and incredibly, overwhelmingly tragic. They are aggressively pantomiming greatness, moving their mouths to spiritual words they do not comprehend, constantly looking around the room with panicked eyes to see if anybody is actually buying the performance. They see the aesthetic, but not the anointing. They see the style, but not the substance. You destroyed their illusion just by being the original masterpiece, making them publicly admit that they would rather be a second-rate you than a first-rate themselves. Number 4, you completely shattered their manufactured social hierarchy by entirely refusing to play your assigned, subordinate role. Insecure, highly toxic individuals are obsessively fixated on establishing rigid, vertical social hierarchies where they are comfortably, artificially situated at the absolute top. They view absolutely every social interaction, every workplace dynamic, and every personal relationship as a highly competitive ladder. They thrive entirely on having obedient underlings, compliant sidekicks, and designated scapegoats who constantly look up to them for basic direction, approval, or punishment. For a very long time, they likely tried very hard to firmly place you in one of those tiny, subordinate, highly controlled boxes. They needed you to stay in that box because your perceived limitations are the absolutely only things that make their fragile egos feel expansive. But as a true chosen one, your massive spiritual awakening naturally, violently shattered those completely artificial boundaries. You outgrew the tiny box, you completely outgrew the room, and eventually, you entirely outgrew them. You completely stopped seeking their toxic permission, you stopped asking for their input, and you leveled up entirely on your own unshakable terms. Psychologically, this is an absolute, catastrophic ego death for the manipulator. Their fragile identity is so deeply intertwined with being the superior authoritative figure in the dynamic that your sudden, undeniable, autonomous rise feels to them like a violent, personal insurrection. They do not ever view relationships as mutual, supportive partnerships. They view them strictly as vertical, competitive power structures. When you explicitly proved that you absolutely do not need them, that you can succeed, massively thrive, and ascend to new heights without their blessing or their permission, you completely destroyed the entire fragile foundation of their worldview. They are in an absolute panic because they rely entirely on a script that dictates you must remain small so they can feel big. When you rewrite that script with your unshakable autonomy, they have absolutely no idea how to function. Metaphorically, it is exactly like watching a highly arrogant, self-proclaimed king sitting proudly on a cheap plastic throne, aggressively barking orders and demanding fierce loyalty from a sovereign subject who has already packed their bags, calmly left the building, and moved to an entirely different, thriving kingdom. The pathetic king is left violently screaming at an entirely empty room. To witness their frantic reaction to this disruption is genuinely tragic and incredibly goofy. They heavily throw their weight around, trying to desperately remind everyone of their past favors, attempting to forcibly put you in your place. But you absolutely cannot be put in a place you do not even acknowledge exists. You made them admit their own pathetic impotence by simply refusing to participate in their delusional game of thrones. You stripped them of their fake power, not by actively overthrowing them, but by completely ignoring the hierarchy they bleed to protect. Number 5. Your deeply regulated nervous system systematically bankrupted their entire emotional economy. Your profound peace is a completely self-sourced, internally regulated ecosystem. You absolutely do not require external chaos to feel alive, and you certainly do not require the validation or the suffering of miserable people to determine your intrinsic worth. Your internal alignment allows you to calmly observe massive chaos without ever absorbing a single drop of it. In stark, undeniable contrast, the toxic, highly performative competitors around you operate entirely as emotional vampires in a strictly trauma-based economy. Their entire fragile nervous system is hopelessly addicted to intense drama, loud conflict, and highly negative energetic exchange. They only feel truly powerful, relevant, and alive when they can successfully alter the emotional state of another human being. Their performative facade absolutely requires them to constantly trigger people so they can greedily feed off the resulting emotional explosion. The psychological driver behind this toxic vampirism is severe energetic starvation and a profound, tragic lack of emotional regulation. Because they absolutely cannot produce their own joy, peace, or satisfaction, they must parasitically steal massive emotional reactions from you just to feel satiated. If they can successfully make you deeply angry, intensely sad, or highly defensive, their fragile ego registers that reaction as raw power. They attempt to control you by entirely controlling your mood. They are entirely reliant on a toxic script, where you are the bleeding host and they are the aggressive parasite. When you respond to their calculated, intense provocations with a completely flat, entirely unbothered, and profoundly serene frequency, you are not just ignoring them. You are actively, intentionally starving them to death. Their fear of stagnation reaches a boiling point because their entire survival strategy relies on the emotional dysregulation of their victims. When you completely refuse to be dysregulated, you render them utterly, entirely powerless. Think of it exactly like a highly aggressive, deeply toxic parasite that has violently attached itself to a host, fully expecting to greedily suck the life out of it. But instead of providing a warm, chaotic bloodstream for the parasite to feed on, the host suddenly, entirely turns into solid, blazing, untouchable fire. The parasite simply cannot feed on fire. It cannot manipulate fire. It can only detach and rapidly wither away in absolute agony, entirely burned by the pure, intense heat of the host's massive alignment. When you deeply linger on the exact emotional mechanics of this, you clearly see the true, profound tragedy of their existence. When you remain completely unbothered, they literally physically go through deep psychological withdrawal symptoms. They will heavily escalate their behavior, throwing significantly bigger and more desperate, unhinged tantrums, frantically trying to find the tiny crack in your armor. They see the calm, but not the absolute ironclad discipline it takes to maintain it. It looks incredibly, deeply frantic from the outside. A fully grown adult aggressively screaming at a solid brick wall, wildly demanding that the wall immediately apologize for not falling down. You completely mastered psychological warfare by simply becoming a completely inhospitable environment for their toxicity. Number 6, you relentlessly exposed the exhausting, high-maintenance reality of their mask simply by resting quietly in your authentic power. Think for a moment about the sheer, staggering amount of caloric, emotional, and psychological energy it takes for a highly performative, deeply insecure person just to exist on a regular Tuesday. They have to constantly, obsessively monitor exactly how they are perceived by complete strangers. They have to carefully curate their entirely fake, highly edited social media presence. They have to frantically try to remember exactly which lies they told to which specific people. They must continuously hype themselves up to maintain the fragile illusion of absolute superiority. Their entire daily life is an endless, exhausting, high-speed marathon of continuous performance, and they can absolutely never, ever step off the track to rest. Now look directly at yourself, the chosen one. Your true power does not ever require daily maintenance. The profound contrast here is exactly between the heavy, suffocating armor of an entirely false identity and the incredible buoyant lightness of authentic being. Your internal architecture is built firmly on raw truth. You absolutely do not have to nervously remember what you said yesterday because you simply told the truth. You do not have to pretend to be someone else because you have radically, entirely accepted exactly who you are. The deep psychology behind their bitter, seething resentment toward you is rooted in a toxic, boiling mix of intense jealousy and sheer chronic fatigue. They look at your effortless grace, your profound ability to sleep completely soundly at night, and your natural, unforced magnetism, and they are filled with a blinding rage. They deeply resent you because you have successfully achieved naturally what they are literally killing themselves trying to manufacture artificially. Their fragile ego simply cannot accept that their grueling, incredibly painful performance is yielding vastly inferior results to your simple, quiet authenticity. Metaphorically, they are exactly like a person trying to forcefully, desperately hold a massive, highly inflated beach ball completely underwater. Their muscles are severely cramping. They are violently shivering. They are struggling to breathe, and their arms are shaking violently from the sheer, agonizing effort of keeping the massive lie submerged. You, meanwhile, are standing comfortably on the warm beach, breathing the fresh ocean air, completely relaxed. When the intense fatigue finally overtakes them, and it absolutely always, inevitably does, the beach ball bursts violently to the surface, hitting them squarely in the face. Their mask completely slips. They have a massive emotional outburst. They loudly contradict themselves publicly, or they engage in a frantic, self-destructive behavior that entirely exposes their true, highly toxic nature to the world. And you are just calmly standing there, quietly watching it happen. You didn't actively push them. You didn't expose them. You just stood by and let their own sheer, suffocating exhaustion do absolutely all the heavy lifting. They made themselves look incredibly goofy simply because they could not maintain the heavy weight of their own lies in the presence of your weightless truth. Number 7, their desperate attempts to entirely isolate you completely backfired because they fundamentally misunderstand the profound power of true solitude. For the deeply insecure, toxic, and highly performative individual, the absolute worst-case scenario in human existence is to be left completely alone with their own thoughts. Their entire emotional survival strategy is completely dependent on having a captive, enabling audience. They desperately need witnesses to constantly validate their permanent victimhood and to loudly applaud their fabricated triumphs. Therefore, their absolute favorite, go-to weapon of psychological manipulation is the looming threat of social isolation. They will dramatically exclude you. They will carefully orchestrate subtle smear campaigns to aggressively turn people against you. And they will try to forcefully cut you out of the group, fully expecting you to eventually break down, crumble, and crawl back, begging for readmission into their toxic, exhausting circle. But they fundamentally and disastrously miscalculated the spiritual, internal makeup of a true chosen one. You have already survived the barren wilderness. You draw immense, terrifying power, crystal clear clarity, and deep cellular regeneration directly from your isolation. You do not just barely survive in the quiet, you absolutely undeniably thrive in it. Your profound internal alignment allows you to be your own absolute best company, constantly receiving high-level guidance, peace, and downloads directly from your divine spiritual source. The psychological shock they violently experience when their massive isolation tactic fails is firmly rooted in their total loss of leverage. They directly projected their own greatest, most debilitating fear entirely onto you. They genuinely believed that without the constant external validation of the crowd, you would be completely destroyed. When they painfully realize that you actually deeply enjoy the solitude they aggressively forced upon you, their entire operational paradigm shatters into a million pieces. Using a highly descriptive, vivid metaphor, their entire strategy is essentially like a group of angry, petty people trying to severely punish a majestic, deep-sea creature by aggressively throwing it straight into the middle of the deepest, darkest ocean. They stand on the shore, proudly dusting their hands off, loudly laughing and congratulating themselves on finally drowning you. Meanwhile, you sink blissfully into the deep, finally entirely free from the shallow, polluted, toxic puddles they aggressively forced you to live in, and you begin to powerfully swim with significantly more grace and speed than ever before. They foolishly tried to punish you with the exact specific environment that you were biologically and spiritually engineered to completely conquer. When you elaborate extensively on the mechanics of this, you clearly see exactly how profoundly embarrassing this entire situation is for them. They sit back eagerly, waiting for you to look miserable, desperately waiting for the frantic apologies. But instead, they are forced to watch you aggressively glow up. They watch you become intensely more focused, significantly more peaceful, and undeniably more successful. You completely won the psychological war by simply enjoying the quiet, peaceful sanctuary they desperately tried to use as a prison. Number 8, you ruthlessly stripped them of their plausible deniability, aggressively exposing them to pure, undeniable, objective reality. You operate entirely in the profound realm of raw, uncompromising honesty. You absolutely do not gaslight yourself, and you entirely refuse to allow others to distort reality in your presence. Your deep alignment is heavily anchored in absolute, objective truth, which means you calmly call things exactly what they are. You clearly see the hidden motives, the passive-aggressive jabs, and the quiet, highly toxic manipulations. The performative individuals actively competing with you survive entirely in the murky, gray areas of plausible deniability. They build their entire performative existence on speaking entirely out of both sides of their mouth. They aggressively throw a heavy rock and immediately, cowardly, hide their hand so they can constantly play the innocent victim if anyone ever accuses them of violence. They desperately, intensely need the cover of darkness and massive ambiguity to maintain their highly fragile ego. The deep, paralyzing psychological terror they experience around you stems entirely from their absolute inability to manipulate your perception of reality. They are utterly terrified of being seen clearly, because being seen clearly absolutely means being held strictly accountable. They rely heavily on a script where they can launch a highly covert attack on you, and when you predictably get upset, they can smugly say, "You're just overreacting. I didn't mean it like that." But you do not overreact. You calmly observe. You meticulously document. You firmly hold the heavy mirror up and completely refuse to let them blur the reflection. When you ruthlessly strip them of their plausible deniability, you completely, entirely destroy their primary psychological defense mechanism. Imagine a sleazy, highly manipulative magician who makes a living performing cheap, deceptive tricks in a dimly lit, smoky room, constantly fooling the naive audience into handing over their money. Suddenly, you calmly walk into the room, walk straight past the audience, and firmly flip the massive industrial floodlights on, brightly illuminating the entire stage. Instantly, absolutely everyone can clearly see the cheap strings attached to his sleeves, the trap door hidden under his feet, and the fake cards stuffed in his pockets. You didn't even say a single word. You didn't yell or aggressively accuse him of being a massive fraud. You just turned the lights on and let the absolute reality speak for itself. Elaborate entirely on the utter, sweating panic they feel in this specific moment. They violently squirm, they nervously stutter, and they frantically try to convince absolutely everyone that the bright lights are lying, that you are the one violently ruining the show. It is a profoundly goofy and entirely tragic sight to see an adult desperately trying to gaslight an entire room full of people who can clearly see the exact strings in their sweating hands. They will actively hate you forever, absolutely not because you lied about them, but because you entirely refused to participate in their pathetic lie. Number 9. You relentlessly exposed the ugly, highly parasitic nature of their conditional loyalty by completely shutting down their emotional funding. The true chosen one operates entirely from a deeply anchored place of unconditional alignment and genuine, unshakable integrity. When you support someone, love someone, or build with someone, it comes directly from a deep internal well of pure authenticity. You give simply because it is in your exact nature to be abundant, and you absolutely do not keep a petty, detailed ledger of favors to constantly hold over people's heads. The toxic, highly performative individuals currently in your orbit operate on a strictly conditional, highly transactional, and completely parasitic economy. Their version of loyalty is absolutely never actually loyalty. It is simply a highly calculated investment strategy. They only value you for what they can aggressively extract from you. Your high-level connections, your pure energy, your hard-earned money, or the elevated social status of simply standing next to your brilliant light. Their entire facade is heavily built on pretending to be a loyal friend while secretly operating as a ruthless debt collector. The deep psychological dysfunction behind this behavior is rooted entirely in use-value narcissism and profound emotional starvation. They simply do not know how to independently generate their own true worth, so they must attach themselves to people who naturally possess massive surplus value. Because their ego is so incredibly fragile, they live in constant, sweating fear of being useless or irrelevant. To heavily compensate, they create completely unspoken binding contracts with you. They do one very small, insignificant favor for you, and in their highly delusional mind, You now absolutely owe them your soul for the rest of eternity. They heavily rely on the toxic script of guilt and obligation to keep you permanently tethered to them. This dynamic is exactly like comparing a rusty mechanical vending machine to a natural, rushing, crystal-clear mountain spring. They are the vending machine. They will only dispense a tiny, artificially packaged piece of support if you insert the exact correct amount of coins, push the exact right buttons, and fully agree to their rigid terms. If you stop putting coins in, they completely, violently shut down and absolutely refuse to operate. You, however, are the natural spring. You just flow organically, generously providing pure water to anyone who passes by, completely unbothered by who drinks. When you suddenly stop inserting coins into their transactional machine, when you finally stop overgiving and stop endlessly appeasing them, they completely short-circuit. They glitch entirely. They start violently screaming about how disloyal you are, completely exposing the highly embarrassing fact that they absolutely never actually loved you. They only loved exactly what you provided for them. It is a profoundly tragic spectacle to watch someone violently shake the vending machine, demanding a refund, while you have already walked far away. You completely mastered the psychological war by simply refusing to be a cheap commodity in their impoverished emotional economy. Number 10. Your radical establishment of boundaries felt to them like an act of unspeakable, unprovoked violence. Toxic systems and deeply performative relationships rely entirely on a complete, absolute lack of boundaries. In order for an insecure person to truly feel powerful and in control, they must be allowed to casually cross lines, deeply disrespect your time, and aggressively siphon your energy whenever they please. They view your endless availability and your deep empathy as a given right, absolutely not an earned privilege, but a massive, defining part of your awakening as a chosen one. Involves the radical, uncompromising installation of ironclad, titanium boundaries. You learn to say a complete, unapologetic no. You completely stopped over-explaining your absence. You firmly stopped tolerating subtle disrespect. And you heavily closed the thick doors to your energetic field. The profound contrast here is between healthy, sovereign self-respect and deeply parasitic, childish entitlement. You view boundaries as the absolute necessary architecture of a healthy, sustainable life. They, conversely, view your boundaries as a violent, deeply personal attack on their supremacy. The deep psychology at work here is exactly the mentality of an intensely spoiled, entitled child facing discipline for the very first time. When you erect a firm boundary, you are aggressively cutting off their supply because they feel entirely entitled to you. They do not interpret your boundary as an act of self-protection. They interpret it as an act of malicious violence directly against them. Their ego absolutely cannot process the rejection. They violently flip the script, heavily playing the traumatized victim, weeping loudly about how cold, heartless, and changed you have become, simply because you totally refuse to let them wipe their muddy shoes on your living room rug anymore. It is precisely like a reckless driver who has spent heavy years joy-riding through a sleepy town, intentionally running over flimsy wooden white picket fences because they know the thin fences will always snap and break away. They feel incredibly powerful, totally unstoppable, and entirely above the law. Then, one dark night, they arrogantly decide to violently ram their car into your fence, completely, totally unaware that you spent the entire winter secretly reinforcing your entire property line with solid heavy steel beams anchored deep in wet concrete. They hit your boundary at full speed, absolutely destroying the entire front end of their own vehicle, while your fence doesn't even suffer a microscopic scratch. Look deeply at the absolute tragedy of their reaction. Instead of taking personal accountability for their reckless driving, they jump out of their smoking, wrecked car and start violently screaming at you for building a fence that was entirely too strong. It looks intensely goofy because their victimhood is entirely 100% self-inflicted by their own aggressive entitlement. You completely mastered the dynamic by simply letting them break their own hands, punching your solid walls. Number 11. They launched a frantic, preemptive smear campaign that served absolutely only as a loud, public confession of their own hidden guilt. When a highly toxic, deeply manipulative dynamic finally breaks down completely, and you, the empowered chosen one, simply walk away in total unbothered silence, the insecure party goes into immediate, panicked overdrive. They launch the massive, preemptive strike. They run breathlessly to mutual friends, family members, or workplace colleagues to desperately spin a heavily edited, completely fictional narrative where they are the poor, innocent victim of your sudden, crazy, and unjustified behavior. They talk about you absolutely incessantly. They try with all their might to completely control the public narrative before you ever have a chance to tell your side of the real story. But here is the flawless, brilliant psychological trap they walk right into entirely blindfolded. You aren't telling your side of the story at all. You are just quietly, happily living your beautifully elevated life. The absolute contrast is between your dignified, quiet, graceful movement forward and their desperate, hyper-verbal, sweating, scrambling mess. The deep psychology of their hyperactive, erratic smear campaign is a classic, undeniable manifestation of a deeply guilty conscience frantically attempting to outrun its own dark shadow. They know exactly, precisely what they did to you in the dark, when absolutely no one else was watching. They know exactly how they secretly used you, maliciously lied to you, or cowardly betrayed you. Their frantic, non-stop need to aggressively convince absolutely everyone else that you are the massive problem is actually just them desperately trying to convince themselves so they don't drown entirely in their own shame. Their incredibly fragile ego is so entirely weak that it must actively try to destroy your pristine reputation to violently protect its own false innocence. The perfect vivid metaphor here is a deeply guilty, heavily sweating thief running full speed down a crowded street, screaming at the top of his lungs that there is a thief on the loose, and pointing frantically at an entirely empty alleyway, just to desperately distract the confused crowd from noticing the stolen goods loudly jingling in his own heavy pockets. But the beautiful, inevitable thing about authentic, truly observant people is that they eventually, always, see right through the frantic, sweaty performance. People slowly start to pause and wonder why. If this chosen one is so terrible, so incredibly toxic, and so unhinged, they are quietly succeeding, glowing, and bothering absolutely no one, while the other person literally cannot stop obsessively, angrily talking about them every single day. Their non-stop over-explanation is a loud, incredibly goofy public confession. You made them completely admit their dark guilt to the entire world without you ever having to take the witness stand, simply by stepping back and letting their own massive paranoia entirely devour them from the inside out. Number 12. They confidently brought petty low-vibrational tactics to a massive spiritual war and instantly realized they were completely, hopelessly outmatched. Your deep strength is incredibly architectural, profoundly spiritual, and heavily cosmically supported. You are absolutely not operating on the incredibly low level of petty human squabbles. You are actively moving in total alignment with divine strategy and profound universal laws. You play the massive, infinite long game, intensely focusing on generational healing, energetic purity, and absolute, unfiltered truth. The highly performative individuals desperately trying to bring you down are entirely stuck in the thick, suffocating mud of low-vibrational, ego-driven scheming. They operate entirely using cheap manipulative tactics, whispered high school gossip, subliminal social media posts, and tiny, heavily calculated microaggressions. They are violently obsessed with winning the immediate moment, securing a temporary, fleeting ego boost, and desperately validating their entirely external facade. The deep psychology heavily driving their frantic behavior is an absolute, undeniable lack of depth and a desperate, sweating need for instant, visible victories to quickly soothe their incredibly fragile self-esteem. They simply cannot comprehend the massive scale of the spiritual warfare you are actively engaged in, because they are entirely disconnected from any higher divine source. They truly, deeply believe that whoever speaks the absolute loudest, schemes the absolute hardest, and manipulates the most people is the ultimate, undeniable victor. They are heavily reliant on the exhausting script of petty office politics or high school drama, entirely oblivious to the massive fact that you have officially graduated from that pathetic arena lifetimes ago. Their ego absolutely demands that they outsmart you, but they literally do not possess the spiritual bandwidth to even understand the basic rules of the massive realm you currently operate within. Imagine calmly walking into a grand, ancient, dimly lit library where you are quietly, meticulously rewriting the exact source code of the entire matrix, shifting massive paradigms and breaking heavy generational curses. Suddenly, an insecure imitator violently kicks the heavy oak door open, walks aggressively up to your desk, slams down a cheap plastic checkers board right on top of your ancient texts, and aggressively challenges you to a petty game. They are heavily sweating, breathing rapidly, completely, deeply convinced that if they manage to double jump your plastic piece, they will somehow instantly conquer your entire spiritual empire. You just slowly look up from your universe-altering manuscript, silently stare at their cheap plastic toys, and blink in absolute, entirely unbothered silence. If you elaborate heavily on exactly how ridiculous this looks, it is the absolute textbook definition of second-hand embarrassment. You will watch them carefully launch incredibly elaborate traps, waiting eagerly in the bushes for your inevitable downfall. And what exactly do you do? Absolutely nothing. You just keep vibrating at a massive frequency, where their tiny tactics simply bounce off your heavily armored aura like soft rubber bullets bouncing off a military tank. They eventually completely exhaust themselves, deeply humiliated by the sudden realization that they are entirely out of their league. Number 13. They became violently, obsessively fixated on your massive, abundant harvest while entirely ignoring the grueling, agonizing reality of your planting season. As a highly aligned chosen one, your deep success, your profound peace, and your immense external abundance are the direct, undeniable result of a grueling, painstaking, and often agonizing planting season. You spent heavy years entirely alone in the dirt. You faithfully watered your tiny seeds with your own tears. You fiercely protected your crops through brutal, freezing spiritual winters, and you did the heavy, incredibly unglamorous, back-breaking labor when absolutely no one was watching and no one believed in you. Your internal architecture is solidly built on the absolute universal law of sowing and reaping. The performative individuals desperately trying to compete with you operate entirely on a frequency of deep delusion and unearned, massive entitlement. They absolutely only care about the shiny end results. They desperately want the beautiful aesthetic of the massive harvest without ever having to touch the filthy mud. The deep psychology of their intensely bitter, seething jealousy is firmly rooted in a profound, stubborn refusal to accept the reality of cause and effect. When they see you happily harvesting the heavy fruits of your intense labor, their highly fragile ego immediately feels aggressively cheated by the universe. They enviously look at your plate, clearly see that it is overflowing, and become furiously, violently convinced that you somehow stole their food. They rely entirely on the highly toxic script that massive success is just a random lottery, a petty game of favorites, and that life is simply being incredibly unfair to them. This massive delusion completely protects them from the devastating, crushing truth that their own plate is entirely empty, simply because they absolutely never planted a single seed. Their profound fear of their own laziness turns into weaponized resentment aimed directly at you. This is exactly like an incredibly lazy, entitled neighbor who spends the entire spring and summer sleeping inside, constantly watching television and loudly mocking you through the window as you entirely break your back, plowing the massive fields in the blazing, unforgiving sun. Then, when autumn finally arrives and your massive barns are completely overflowing with food, they walk over with an entirely empty basket, absolutely furious, loudly demanding to know exactly why God heavily blessed your land and completely cursed theirs. They try to sneak into your fields in the dead of night to violently steal your fruit, entirely convinced they deserve it just as much as you do. Look closely at the absolute, undeniable tragedy of their obsession. They will actively spend hours stalking your social media, highly analyzing your life, furiously trying to figure out the secret to your massive harvest, all while the exact tools they absolutely need to cultivate their own life are rapidly rusting in their shed. They see the massive blessing, but absolutely refuse to see the immense burden of the daily work. It looks completely frantic and deeply pathetic from the outside, watching someone aggressively try to eat the fruit off a massive tree they actively, stubbornly refuse to ever water. Number 14. The final, devastating surrender happens when they realize your unshakable alignment is a massive force they cannot manipulate, mimic, or destroy. The absolute ultimate hallmark of your profound internal alignment is your terrifying ability to remain totally, entirely unmovable in the face of absolute, manufactured chaos. You are deeply, firmly grounded in your own truth, which means you absolutely do not need to desperately defend your character against entirely false accusations, and you do not need to frantically scramble to correct every tiny intentional misunderstanding. You know exactly, undeniably, who you are. The highly insecure imitators competing with you, however, live in a constant, sweating state of frantic projection because they are entirely unwilling to face their own massive toxicity, intense self-hatred, and blinding jealousy. Their highly fragile ego violently, aggressively ejects those dark traits outward, heavily projecting them onto the closest, brightest target they can possibly find, which is always you. The deepest, most profound psychological mechanism at play in this final stage is the complete, catastrophic collapse of their unstoppable illusion. They have spent their entire lives manipulating, aggressively intimidating and completely breaking down weak-willed individuals, developing a massive, entirely unearned God complex. They genuinely believe that reality completely bends to their specific will, and that anyone who stands in their way will eventually be crushed. But then they violently crash directly into you. They aggressively throw absolutely everything they have at you. They frantically try to ruin your reputation. They desperately try to provoke you into a reaction, and they hurl every single ounce of their toxic energy directly at your spirit. And you simply do not move. You do not break. You do not even slightly flinch. The profound fear that completely swallows them in this exact moment is the terrifying realization that they are absolutely not gods. They are not unstoppable. Their entire script has completely, entirely run out of pages, and they are forcefully, violently forced to silently yield to the overpowering, undeniable reality of your massive, energetic dominance. Metaphorically, they are exactly like a massive, incredibly violent, chaotic ocean storm, screaming, violently churning, and aggressively throwing massive, dark waves, absolutely convinced they can effortlessly destroy the shore. But you are the massive, ancient, heavily fortified stone lighthouse. You absolutely do not fight the waves. You do not scream back at the howling wind. You just quietly stand there, brightly shining your light, completely unfazed as their highly chaotic energy violently shatters against your solid base and entirely dissolves into completely harmless, tiny bubbles of foam. This is the absolute psychological endgame. By doing absolutely nothing, by standing entirely still, you violently force them to completely exhaust their entire arsenal against your unshakable peace. You absolutely watch them retreat, tired, broken, and completely exposed, looking utterly foolish for ever thinking they could dismantle what the divine has built. You made them admit their ultimate powerlessness simply by completely refusing to be moved. When you zoom out and deeply look at absolutely all of this, when you view the entire sprawling battlefield from the highly elevated, spiritual vantage point you have fought so incredibly hard to reach, one single, absolute truth becomes entirely impossible to ignore. The actual target of their frantic attacks was absolutely never your job. The target was entirely never your physical possessions, and the true target was absolutely never your superficial relationships. The true, absolute target of their relentless, desperate psychological warfare was always your pure, authentic frequency and your divine energy. They desperately wanted to violently pull you entirely out of your profound spiritual alignment, because your deep, unwavering peace is the absolute most terrifying thing their fragile egos have ever encountered. You violently forced them to highly confront the vacuous, total architectural failure of their own miserable lives simply by standing incredibly tall in yours. You absolutely do not need to lift a single, tiny finger in petty revenge. You entirely do not need to actively descend to their highly chaotic level to prove a massive point. And you certainly, absolutely do not need to endlessly, desperately explain yourself to the highly committed, aggressive misunderstanding of a deeply fragile, performative ego. Their absolute destruction is entirely, perfectly self-inflicted, and their ultimate massive punishment is the absolute tragedy of having to actually wake up every single day and simply be themselves. Your only job right now, chosen ones, is to absolutely keep building your massive internal architecture. Keep quietly stacking your heavy bricks in the absolute silence. Keep heavily vibrating at a deeply authentic, massive level that they cannot even begin to slightly access. You have already won the massive war by simply refusing to entirely abandon yourself. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Stay chosen. Stay blessed.